What if I told you that the greatest defeat in Roman history did not take place at Cannae, as is commonly believed? We are accustomed to thinking that Hannibal inflicted the most terrible wound on the Republic, but the events at Arausio eclipsed even that nightmare. There on the banks of the Rhone, it was not the genius of the enemy, but the stupidity and pride of their own commanders that doomed two huge armies to destruction. This is not a story of military valor, but of how personal ambition can destroy more lives than any enemy weapon. The catastrophe that Rome would rather forget became a lesson learned at the cost of 120,000 lives. Watch the video to the end to find out how this tragedy changed the Roman army forever and led to the birth of a new empire. Are you ready to learn the truth about why the Roman army was divided even before the battle began? The main cause of the disaster was not the barbarians, but two men who hated each other more than they hated the enemy. Command was divided between consul Gnaeus Mallius Maximus and proconsul Quintus Servilius Scipio. They were men from different worlds whose forced coexistence became a death sentence for their soldiers. Maximus was a new man, the first of his kind to attain the highest power, and he had earned his position through talent and popular support. Scipio, on the other hand, represented the old, haughty aristocracy, which considered upstarts like Maximus unworthy of even sharing a tent with the patricians. The conflict between them began long before they saw the first detachments of the Cimbri and Teutones. Scipio, as a representative of an ancient family, considered it a personal insult to have to obey a man without noble ancestors. According to Roman law, Consul Maximus had seniority and was supposed to exercise overall command of the combined forces. However, for Scipio, subordination gave way to class pride, and he openly sabotaged any attempts at coordination. He behaved as if he were in the Roman Forum, not facing mortal danger. This feud was not just a war of words, it paralyzed the entire system of command of the giant army. Instead of combining their forces into one powerful fist, the Romans acted as two independent and even hostile groups. The soldiers saw that their commanders were not communicating, and this sowed uncertainty and anxiety among the legionaries. The discipline on which the entire power of the Roman legions depended began to crack under the weight of the commander's ambitions. Mid-level officers did not know whose orders to follow and often received conflicting instructions. Maximus tried to establish contact, realizing that in the face of a horde of barbarians, political differences had to be forgotten. He sent messengers, proposed meetings, and tried to develop a common plan of action to defend the province. But each of his proposals was met with a wall of cold contempt and arrogance from the proconsul. Scipio saw Maxime's attempts at unification as nothing more than a desire to claim the glory of future victory for himself. He was confident that he could handle the situation on his own and did not want to share the triumph with a man of low birth. Such behavior was not just foolishness, it was criminal disregard for the lives of tens of thousands of Roman citizens. A gloomy foreboding reigned in Maximus's camp, as the soldiers understood that without the support of Scipio's cavalry and elite units, they were vulnerable. In Scipio's camp, on the contrary, there was a dangerous overconfidence fueled by the commander's speeches about the superiority of the Roman nobility. This psychological gap between the two camps was wider than the river that separated their positions. No one could have imagined that personal animosity would go so far as to cause a national tragedy. The Roman Senate, far away in Italy, tried to intervene and force the commanders to cooperate. Letters were sent demanding that they join forces and act together for the good of the Republic. But at such a distance, the senators' authority lost its power in the face of wounded pride on the ground. Scipio found formal reasons to ignore the directives or interpret them in his favor. He created a situation in which any defeat could be blamed on the incompetence of his partner. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the two commanders had completely different views on the tactics and strategy of warfare. Maximus, being more cautious and pragmatic, preferred a defensive position, taking advantage of the terrain. Scipio, on the other hand, wanted a quick and decisive attack to crush the enemy in one blow. These differences made it impossible to create a united front of defense, which was necessary against such a numerous enemy. Each of them was preparing for his own war, ignoring reality. As a result, instead of one invincible Roman army, Two vulnerable corps stood on the banks of the Rhone. They were deprived of the main advantage of the Romans, organization and unity of command. History knows many examples of rivalry between generals, but rarely has it led to such fatal consequences. This was a case where the internal enemy proved more dangerous than the external one. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how the personal ambitions of leaders can affect the fate of thousands of people, even in our time? Write about it in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories. What if I showed you a place that was supposed to be Rome's shield but became its grave? The Rhône River Valley where this tragedy unfolded was a strategically important border, separating the civilized world from the wildlands. The city of Arausio, now known as Orange, stood in the way of the migration of huge masses of people whom the Romans called barbarians. This was no ordinary military invasion. It was the resettlement of entire peoples seeking new lands to live in. The Cimbri and Teutones, who had left their northern lands, were a force akin to a natural disaster. The number of newcomers was impossible to calculate accurately and caused terror in anyone who saw their endless columns. These were not only warriors, but also women, children, and old people who moved along with the army in huge carts. According to the most conservative estimates, the total number of people in this wave of migration exceeded 500,000. There were hundreds of thousands of warriors, hardened by migrations and skirmishes, which significantly outnumbered the Roman forces. It was a living avalanche, sweeping away everything in its path and demanding living space. The Romans had already encountered the Cimbri before and suffered painful defeats, which should have served as a warning. But fear of the barbarians was mixed with imperial arrogance and confidence in the superiority of Roman weapons. The legionaries who arrived at Arausio saw before them not just an enemy, but an unknown and formidable force. Rumors of the Germans' gigantic stature and incredible physical strength were passed from soldier to soldier. These stories undermined morale even before the battle began, sowing seeds of panic. The terrain around Arausio was difficult, with a river on one side and hills on the other, which limited maneuverability. For the huge Roman army, this place could be both an ideal defensive position and a deadly trap. The Rhône River was deep and fast-flowing, providing reliable cover for the flank, but it also cut off any means of retreat. If the crossing failed, it would be virtually impossible to cross under enemy fire. The commanders had to take this factor into account, but it seems they were focused solely on the offensive. The weather at that time of year was inclement, with cold winds and rain turning the ground into sticky mud. This created additional difficulties for the heavy Roman infantry, accustomed to firm ground. The barbarians, accustomed to the harsh climate of the north, felt more confident in such conditions. Nature itself seemed to be playing into the hands of the invaders, complicating life for the defenders of the south. Every day of waiting in damp tents exhausted the Roman soldiers physically and morally. Intelligence reported the approach of the main forces of the Cimbri, and the smoke from their numerous fires obscured the horizon. This sight should have made the Roman commanders forget their quarrels and unite in the face of a common threat. But instead, the proximity of the enemy only exacerbated the rivalry between Maximus and Scipio. Each feared that the other would start the battle first and claim all the glory of victory for himself. The tension in the air was palpable, and it did not come only from the enemy. The Cimbri, despite their numbers, were in no hurry to attack, showing unexpected caution for barbarians. They understood the strength of the Roman legions and were perhaps looking for ways to reach a peaceful solution or gain a favorable tactical position. Their chiefs were experienced leaders who knew how to wait and strike at the most opportune moment. This pause before the storm was the most frightening time for the ordinary soldiers awaiting their fate. The silence over the Rhone Valley was deceptive, foreshadowing a storm that Rome had never seen before. The strategic importance of the battle was enormous, because in case of defeat, the road to Italy itself would be open. There were no serious forces behind Arausio's army that could stop the invasion. The very existence of Rome was at stake, but its defenders were preoccupied with internal strife. It was a classic example of how underestimating the enemy and overestimating one's own strength leads to disaster. History was about to teach a cruel lesson, but the students were too busy with themselves. The barbarians were approaching, and with each passing hour, the chance of salvation melted away, giving way to inevitability. The Roman war machine, which usually ran like clockwork, this time failed in its most important mechanism. Did you know that the barbarians first tried to negotiate, but their envoys were rejected? In the next chapter, you will learn how pride drowned out the voice of reason. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of Roman bravery? A few days before the main battle, an event took place that vividly demonstrated the depth of Roman arrogance and blindness. The advance guard under the command of Legate Marcus Aurelius Scavrus clashed with the vanguard of the Cimbri and was completely destroyed. Scavrus himself, a respected commander and consul, was taken prisoner by the barbarians, but did not bow his head. This episode could have become a heroic legend, had it not been for its tragic and senseless ending. Scavrus was brought to the tent of the Cimbri king Boiorix, where the tribal chiefs had gathered. The barbarians wanted to see the Roman commander and perhaps use him as a negotiator or source of information. But Scavrus behaved not as a prisoner, but as the master of the situation, despite his chains. He boldly declared to the king that resistance to Rome was futile and that the Cimbri would be better off turning back while they were still alive. He threatened them with the invincible power of the legions, which, according to him, would wipe the barbarians off the face of the earth. This speech was imbued with the very imperial pride that blinded the Roman elite of the time. Scavrus sincerely believed that the very name of Rome should inspire awe even in the wild peoples of the north. He did not understand that he was not facing scattered bands, but a huge organized force that knew its own worth. His words aroused not fear, but fury in the young chiefs surrounding the king. For them, the conquerors of many peoples, such threats from an unarmed prisoner sounded like a ridiculous insult. According to reports, Boiorix listened to the Roman with surprise for some time, perhaps assessing his courage. However, Scavrus' audacity crossed all boundaries of what was acceptable in communication with the victor. One of the young chiefs, unable to bear the insults to his people, drew his sword and stabbed the Roman on the spot. Thus perished an experienced commander whose knowledge of the enemy could have saved the main army. His death was the first warning sign that the old methods of intimidation would not work with this enemy. This murder should have sobered up the Roman command and shown that negotiations from a position of strength were impossible. But the news of Scavrus' death only spurred Caepion's aggression and his desire for revenge. Instead of analyzing the reasons for the defeat of the advance guard, the Romans took it as a challenge requiring an immediate bloody response. The death of an entire legion in the skirmish was attributed to chance rather than the tactical superiority of the enemy. No one wanted to admit that the Cimbri were as good at fighting as the Romans, if not better. The death of Scavrus also showed that the barbarians were not afraid to kill high-ranking Romans and would not show reverence for titles. It was a war of annihilation, where status and origin offered no protection. But Caepio and Maximus were too caught up in their rivalry to see this obvious fact. They continued to live under the illusion that the barbarians were a disorganized mob that could be easily dispersed. This blindness was more terrifying than any weapon in the hands of the Cimbri. The episode with Scavrus became symbolic of the entire campaign: senseless bravery verging on stupidity and a complete misunderstanding of reality. The Romans went into battle with their eyes closed, guided by their prejudices and myths about their own greatness. Scaurus' blood on the ground of the barbarian camp was only the first drop in the sea that would soon be spilled at Arausio. The irony of fate was that it was people like Scaurus and Caepion who, with their arrogance, dug the grave of the Republic themselves. This short but brutal episode reflected the essence of the conflict between civilizations at that time. On the one hand, there was an unshakable belief in the right to rule. On the other, there was a primitive force that did not recognize authority. The clash between these two worlds was inevitable, and it could not end in peace. Rome lost its chance to get to know its enemy, choosing instead to insult it. Scavrus' feat, if it can be called that, did nothing but hasten the outcome. He died believing in Rome's invincibility, not knowing that in a few days, that invincibility would be trampled into the mud. His fate became a grim omen for all who stood under the Roman banners. Would you be able to maintain such audacity in the face of death? Like this story if you found it impressive. What if I told you that the greatest army in the world was defeated not on the battlefield, but in its own tents? The situation at Arausio reached the point of absurdity. Two parts of the same Roman army were camped at a considerable distance from each other, separated not only by the enmity of their commanders, but also physically. The Rhône River served as a natural border, but Capian deliberately chose a position so as not to mix with Maximus's troops. He refused to even discuss the possibility of creating a single fortified camp, which was standard Roman military practice. This violation of basic security rules shocked even the ordinary legionaries who were accustomed to order. Consul Maximus, realizing the vulnerability of this situation, repeatedly sent envoys to Capio with requests to move the camp closer. He argued that this was necessary for mutual support and convenience in supplying the troops. But the proconsul saw this as nothing more than an attempt by Maximus to subjugate him and seize command of the elite legions. Capio responded with refusals, sometimes in a rude and offensive manner, showing complete disregard for his colleague. His pride forced him to act contrary to common sense in the interest of the cause. The soldiers of both armies were forced to watch this theater of the absurd, realizing that they were the ones held hostage by the situation. Unrest began in the camps, with veterans openly discussing the stupidity of their commanders and predicting disaster. Instead of preparing for battle, cleaning their weapons and strengthening the ramparts, the army wasted its energy on internal squabbles. Morale, the invisible backbone of any army, was being undermined by each day of inaction and discord. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but the authority of the high command was visibly declining. At one point, it seemed that reason might prevail when officers from both headquarters gathered to implore the commanders to reconcile. It was an unprecedented event. Subordinates were practically demanding that their generals fulfill their direct duties. Under pressure from the army, Capian reluctantly agreed to move his camp to the same bank of the river where Maximus was stationed. However, even this step was taken with reservations and demonstrative discontent. He crossed the river but set up camp separately, maintaining distance and independence. Capian's new camp was positioned so that in the event of an attack, he would be the first to engage in battle and claim all the glory for himself. He deliberately placed his legions closer to the enemy, effectively blocking Maximus's ability to maneuver. This was not a tactical decision, but a political gesture dictated by envy and ambition. Instead of a united front, the Romans ended up with two isolated pockets of defense, each vulnerable to encirclement. This arrangement was a gift to the Cimbri, who were closely watching the enemy's movements. Maximus, seeing this madness, found himself in a hopeless situation. He could not order Capio to obey by force without starting a civil war right under the barbarians' noses. He could only hope that in the hour of battle, the proconsul's instinct for self-preservation would compel him to act wisely. But hope is a poor strategy when you are facing a horde of 100,000. The Roman army, divided in two, was an ideal target for a piecemeal attack. The enemy saw this gap clearly and was preparing to take full advantage of it. Supplying the two separate camps also became a logistical nightmare. Wagons with provisions got mixed up. Quartermasters argued over who owned which supplies. The chaos in the rear mirrored the chaos in the minds of the commanders. Instead of a well-oiled military machine, an uncontrollable organism torn by contradictions had formed on the banks of the Rhone. Every hour of delay brought the inevitable denouement closer, but the commanders were blind to the danger. Even nature itself seemed to be warning the Romans. The river was raging, the weather was deteriorating, but the signs were ignored. Titian was so obsessed with the idea of superiority over Maximus that he seemed to have forgotten about the existence of the Cimbri. For him, the main enemy was his fellow consul, not the barbarians standing at the gates. This substitution of concepts became a fatal mistake for which they had to pay with blood. It is difficult to find another example in the history of warfare where an army was so perfectly prepared for defeat by its own generals. The divided camp became a symbol of a divided Rome, where personal interest took precedence over those of the state. The lesson taught by Arausio was a cruel one. Unity of command is not a whim, but a condition for survival. How did the enemy react to such a gift of fate? In the next chapter, you will learn how the Cimbri tried to use diplomacy before taking up arms. Despite their reputation as savage barbarians, the Cimbri showed surprising prudence to the Romans and tried to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. King Boiorix, seeing the enormous strength of the Romans, decided to make a last attempt to negotiate peace. He sent envoys to the camp of Consul Maximus, as he was formerly the commander-in-chief. The Cimbri did not ask for war, but for land where they could settle and live, growing grain and raising livestock. Their campaign was motivated by hunger and the loss of their homeland, not a thirst for destruction's sake. Maximus, being a reasonable man and understanding the gravity of the situation, was ready to listen to the envoy's proposals. He understood that a battle with such a horde was unpredictable and could cost Rome too dearly. Negotiations could buy time, allow reserves to be brought in, or find a compromise solution. The meeting with the envoys took place in a tense but business-like atmosphere, where possible resettlement options were discussed. It was a fragile chance to prevent disaster, hanging by a thread. However, news of the negotiations instantly reached Scipio's camp, causing him to fly into a rage and panic. The proconsul was not afraid that the negotiations would fail, but that they would succeed. If Maximus concluded peace or a treaty, all the glory of being the savior of Rome and pacifier of the barbarians would go to him. For an ambitious aristocrat, the thought that the new man would achieve triumph without striking a single blow with his sword was unbearable. Scipio saw diplomacy as a threat to his career and reputation. Instead of supporting his colleague, Scipion decided to disrupt the negotiations in the most brutal and irreversible way possible. He ordered his troops to prepare for an immediate attack, ignoring the truce during the negotiations. His logic was simple and terrible. If he started the battle now, Maximus would have no choice but to join the fight. Scipius hoped that a surprise attack by his elite legions would wipe out the barbarians and bring him the laurels of victory alone. Scipio's actions were not only a violation of subordination, but also a betrayal of common Roman interests. He put not only his own army at risk, but also Maximus's army, which was not ready for battle and hoped for a peaceful outcome. The Cimbri, seeing Scipio's aggressive maneuvers, perceived this as treachery and deception on the part of the Romans. Trust in the negotiators vanished instantly, and the barbarians realized that it was impossible to reach an agreement with these people. Boiorix, learning of the Romans' treachery, broke off negotiations and began to deploy his troops for battle. The chance for a peaceful solution was irretrievably lost, trampled under the boot of a Roman aristocrat. Now, instead of dialogue, weapons would do the talking, and the Cimbri were determined to punish the liars. The fury of the barbarians, fueled by a sense of injustice, made them even more dangerous opponents. Maximus found himself in a terrible position. Negotiations had broken down, the enemy was enraged, and his own flank was exposed due to the insane actions of Scipio. He could not stop the proconsul, who was already leading his legions into position for attack. All that remained for Maximus was to hastily assemble his troops, trying to prepare in some way for the inevitable blow. Chaos and confusion reigned in the Roman positions, while the barbarians acted in a coordinated and orderly manner. This was a moment when history could have taken a different course, had it not been for the selfishness of one man. Peace was possible, and thousands of lives could have been saved, but the thirst for glory proved stronger than common sense, and the wheel of war was set in motion at full speed. The failure of the negotiations was the point of no return for the Roman army at Arausio. Now there was no option but to fight to the death, and the Romans, thanks to their commanders, approached this battle in the worst possible condition. What if I told you that the Romans' first attack was not a battle, but suicide? Scipius, blinded by his thirst for glory and fear that Maximus would steal his victory, threw his legions forward without reconnaissance or preparation. He was confident that his elite troops, the cream of the Roman army, would easily crush the barbarian mob with one powerful blow. It was an attack dictated not by tactical necessity, but by pure hysteria and ambition. The legionaries went into battle without the support of Maximus's army, effectively alone against the entire horde. Scipio's army's strike fell on empty ground as the Cimbri skillfully used the terrain and lured the Romans into a prepared trap. As soon as the legions were drawn into battle and lost their formation, the main forces of the barbarians attacked them from the flanks and rear. The Germans, with their numerical superiority and fury, literally overwhelmed the Roman ranks. What was supposed to be a triumphant attack instantly turned into a chaotic massacre. The Romans, trapped on all sides, could neither maneuver nor retreat. The battle was short and brutal. Scipio's army ceased to exist as an organized force in a matter of hours. The legionaries, accustomed to victory, found themselves helpless in the face of a superior and frenzied enemy. Discipline collapsed and panic set in, but there was nowhere to run. The Cimbri took no prisoners that day, avenging the treachery and death of their people in previous skirmishes. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of Roman soldiers, and the legion's banners were trampled into the mud. Scipion himself, the initiator of this catastrophe, did not perish with his soldiers, but managed to escape, abandoning his army to its fate. His flight was the final act of betrayal against the men he had led to their deaths. He saved his own life, but forever covered his name with indelible shame. At that time, his soldiers, whom he considered the best in the world, were dying under the blows of barbarian swords and axes. The destruction of Scipio's army took place before the eyes of Maximus's soldiers, who stood in their camp and could do nothing to help. They saw the wave of barbarians engulf their comrades and heard the cries of the dying. This sight paralyzed the will of the remaining Romans, instilling in them an animalistic fear of the enemy's strength. They understood that now they were alone against this whole mass, intoxicated with blood and victory. The defeat of the First Army did not simply weaken the Romans, it deprived them of half their fighting power and completely demoralized the other half. The strategic defense plan, if there ever was one, collapsed completely. Having eliminated the threat on one flank, the Cimbri could now concentrate all their forces on Maximus's camp. The situation went from critical to hopeless in less than a day. The barbarians captured Scipio's camp, gaining access to rich spoils and food supplies. This further emboldened them and strengthened their confidence in complete victory. Roman pride, personified by the proconsul's abandoned camp, was trampled and plundered. Now nothing stood between the Cimbri and the last stronghold of Roman defense. This day became a black day for Roman arms, when the myth of the invincibility of the legions was blown away by the wind over the Rhone Valley. But the worst was yet to come, for the second part of the tragedy was just beginning. Can you imagine how the soldiers in the second camp felt when they saw the death of their comrades? In the next chapter, you will learn how the trap finally snapped shut. After destroying Scipio's army, the Cimbri wasted no time and turned their full force against Maximus's army. The Romans, demoralized by the defeat they had witnessed, found themselves with their backs to the Rhône River. It was the very river that was supposed to protect their flank, but now it had become an insurmountable barrier to retreat. The position that Maximus had chosen for defense turned into a deadly trap from which there was no escape. The soldiers realized that they were trapped, and this realization robbed them of their last strength to resist. The barbarians' attack was devastating. They rolled in wave after wave, giving the Romans not a second's respite. The Cimbri's numerical superiority was now absolute, and they used it to simply overwhelm their opponents with sheer numbers. The Roman lines, already shaky with fear, buckled and broke under the pressure. What began was not a battle, but the methodical extermination of the remnants of the Roman army. The men were no longer fighting for victory, but to survive for a few more minutes. Those who tried to escape threw themselves into the cold waters of the Rhone, hoping to swim to the other side. But in heavy armor, under a hail of arrows and spears, most of them simply drowned, carried away by the fast current. The river became a second grave for the Roman army, swallowing thousands of lives of those who had escaped the sword. The waters of the Rhone turned red, carrying the terrible news downstream to the sea. There was no salvation on land or in the water. Maximus' camp was in utter chaos. The commander's orders were drowned out by the cries of panic and the noise of battle. Unlike Scipio, Maximus himself lost his sons in this battle, who had fought alongside him. The commander's tragedy merged with that of the entire army, becoming a symbol of shared grief. The defense crumbled into separate pockets of resistance, which the barbarians extinguished one by one. The scale of the losses was monstrous even by the standards of cruel antiquity. Ancient historians cite figures ranging from 80,000 to 120,000 dead Romans and their allies. It was not just the loss of an army, it was the destruction of an entire generation of Roman men. A huge number of support personnel, servants, merchants, carters, were also killed or taken prisoner. Never before had Rome lost so many people in a single battle, even in the darkest days of the war with Hannibal. By the evening of that terrible day, the Roman army had ceased to exist physically. The battlefield was littered with bodies, and the silence that descended on the valley was more terrifying than the noise of battle. The barbarians celebrated their greatest victory, capturing enormous trophies and proving their superiority. Rome, meanwhile, had suffered a blow from which it seemed impossible to recover. This defeat showed the complete failure of the old Roman military system in the face of a new threat. A militia of citizens led by incompetent aristocrats could no longer guarantee the security of the state. The price of this lesson was unbearably high, but it was precisely this that forced Rome to change. The deaths of tens of thousands of people were a direct consequence of pride and fragmentation. Arausio became synonymous with disaster, but also the starting point of a new era. Rome was brought to its knees, and the question was no longer about victory, but about the survival of the nation. How did Rome survive the news of this horror? We will discuss this in the next chapter. When the first news of the disaster reached Rome, the city was plunged into a state of near madness. People refused to believe the scale of the tragedy because in the minds of the Romans, the legions were invincible. But as the few survivors arrived and confirmed the destruction of two armies, shock turned to panic. It seemed that tomorrow the barbarians would appear at the gates of the city and no one would be able to stop them. Rome was left without an army, without defense, open to invasion by the most terrible force it had ever known. The Senate, usually a bastion of calm and steadfastness, was at a loss, not knowing where to find new soldiers. Almost every family in Rome had lost someone at Arausio, a father, son, brother, or husband. Mourning was universal, weeping filled the streets, and it seemed as if the very air was saturated with grief. However, the Senate, realizing the danger of demoralization, took an unprecedented step. A decree was issued prohibiting women from publicly mourning the dead and limiting mourning to a few days. The state had to show that it was not broken, even if the hearts of its citizens were broken. The authorities tried to mobilize all remaining resources to defend the city. Old men, teenagers, and even slaves were called up and promised freedom in return for their service. Rome was turning into an armed camp, awaiting siege and assault. Fear of the German fury, Furor Teutonicus, became the dominant feeling of the time. In this atmosphere of despair, the figure of Gaius Marius emerged on the political scene. It was to him, a talented commander and new man, that the eyes of the people and the Senate turned. The people saw him as the only savior capable of stopping the barbarians and restoring the power of the army. The old aristocratic rules were discarded. Marius was elected consul year after year, contrary to the law. The disaster at Arausio destroyed the political monopoly of the nobility and paved the way for reforms. Publius Rutilius Rufus, the other consul, began to use new methods of training soldiers, borrowed from gladiators. He understood that the old training system no longer worked against such an enemy. The Romans learned not only to stand in formation, but also to fence, dodge, and deliver deadly blows in individual combat. The army began to transform from a civilian militia into a professional killing machine. Fortunately for Rome, after their victory, the Cimbri did not immediately march on Italy, but turned towards Spain. This respite, gifted by fate, gave Marius the time he needed to create a new army. The Romans used every day of this respite to forge weapons and drill recruits. The city lived in tense anticipation, preparing for revenge. Aurelian became a painful but necessary cure for complacency. He showed that the old Rome had died on the banks of the Rhone, and that in order to survive, a new Rome must be born. Fear became the fuel for changes that would forever alter the face of the ancient world. But what happened to the gold that supposedly cursed the Roman army? That's what the next chapter's about. There is a mystical and dark page in the history of the Battle of Arausio, connected with the so-called Gold of Toulouse. It is a legend that has stirred the minds of treasure hunters and historians for centuries. Shortly before the military disaster, Consul Quintus Servilius Scipio captured the rebellious Gallic city of Tolosa, which we know today as Toulouse. He not only suppressed the uprising, but also committed an act of unprecedented looting of local sacred sites. The loot was truly colossal, amounting to tons of pure gold and silver. According to ancient legend, these treasures were cursed as they had been accumulated in sanctuaries for centuries and belonged to vengeful Celtic gods. No mortal dared touch them, fearing to bring terrible misfortune upon themselves. However, the Roman general was not deterred by local superstitions when he saw the glitter of precious metal. This enormous treasure was to be officially sent to Rome to replenish the state treasury. A huge caravan of carts loaded with riches set off for Italy under heavy guard. But on the way to Massilia, an event occurred that shook the entire Roman world. The caravan was brazenly attacked and completely plundered by unknown masked robbers. Strangely, the entire numerous guard of the caravan was killed to the last man. The gold disappeared without a trace, as if it had vanished into thin air, leaving not a single coin on the road. Dark rumors immediately began to spread in Rome about who was really behind this crime. Malicious tongues claimed that Scipion himself had organized the robbery in order to secretly appropriate the untold riches for himself. The attackers had acted too professionally, and the witnesses had disappeared too conveniently. Many superstitious citizens believed that it was precisely this sacrilege and greed that had brought the wrath of the gods upon the entire Roman army. The curse of the gold of Tolosa became a very popular explanation for the reasons behind the monstrous catastrophe at Arausio. In people's minds, everything came together into a single picture. The gods punished Rome for the sins of its commander. It was believed that the cursed gold would bring misfortune and a painful death to anyone who touched it. Indeed, the further fate of Scipio was tragic, as if confirming the terrible legend. After his shameful defeat in battle, his life turned into a living hell on earth. Not only was he disgracefully stripped of his command of the army, but he was also stripped of his Roman citizenship. For a patrician of that time, this was the highest form of humiliation, equivalent to death. His property was completely confiscated by the state, and he himself was fined a huge sum. This fine was so large that no one in the world could pay it. In the end, the once proud and influential aristocrat died in exile. He died in complete obscurity and poverty, cursed by his people. The story of the gold added a dark and sinister tone to the image of Scipio. He was forever remembered by posterity as a man whose greed and pride knew no bounds. Scipion became a symbol of all that was worst in the Roman elite of the time. He personified corruption, sacrilege, and complete professional incompetence. The people hated him not only for the death of their sons on the battlefield. They hated him for theft, which was believed to have deprived the gods of their rightful share and deprived Rome of protection. The trial of Scipio became a high-profile political trial that was followed by the entire republic. The old aristocracy tried to justify and defend their representative, but to no avail. The missing gold was never found, remaining one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of antiquity. Perhaps it still lies somewhere in the deep caves or lakes of Provence, waiting for its hour to come. Treasures are often found after thousands of years, and who knows where the treasure of the Celts is hidden. But for Rome, the loss of material gold was insignificant compared to the loss of military honor and men. The legend of the curse became simply a convenient way to explain the inexplicable to the proud Romans. It was easier for them to believe in mysticism than to admit that their system of government was rotten. This episode vividly shows how deeply moral decay had penetrated the upper echelons of society. Greed went hand in hand with stupidity, and a cruel retribution for this was inevitable. The gold of Tholos became an eternal symbol of the price to be paid for dishonor and greed. Ultimately, Rome's real curse was not the mythical gold of the barbarians. The curse was people like Kipian, who were at the helm of power. Getting rid of them was the first and most important step toward the recovery of the state. The Battle of Erebus, despite all its chilling horror, was a turning point in the history of military art. It was on the ashes of this grand catastrophe that Rome's military power was reborn. Gaius Marius, a talented commander and reformer, carried out his famous reforms that changed the world. He created the classic Roman legion that we know from movies and books. Marius took a radical step and abolished the property qualification for recruits. Previously, only those who owned property could serve in the army, but there was a catastrophic shortage of people. Marius allowed poor people who had nothing to their name to join the legions. The state undertook to provide them with weapons, armor, and pay. This ingenious solution instantly eliminated the problem of a shortage of soldiers. Thousands of disadvantaged people were given the chance for a new life, career, and spoils. The army ceased to be a temporary gathering of citizens called up only for the period of war. It turned into a formidable professional force where war became a craft. Soldiers now served for years, constantly training and honing their killing skills. They became true masters of war, not just peasants with swords in their hands. Strict standardization of equipment was introduced so that each soldier was a replaceable cog in the machine. A new type of spear called the pilum appeared, which became the hallmark of the legionaries. A famous symbol was introduced, the silver eagle of the legion, which became sacred to every soldier. Marius made the army incredibly mobile and independent of supply trains. He forced soldiers to carry all their belongings, food, and tools on themselves in huge bundles. For this, they were jokingly nicknamed Marius's mules. But this measure allowed the troops to move at incredible speed. These global changes allowed Rome to take brutal revenge after only a few years. The renewed legions met the Cimbri and Teutones in the battles of Aquae Sextii and Vercellae. The new army worked on the battlefield as a single, perfectly tuned, deadly mechanism. The soldiers who had gone through the harsh school of Marius knew no fear or doubt. The Roman victory was complete and absolute, and the enemies were almost completely destroyed. The threat from the north, which had hung over Italy for so long, was eliminated for centuries to come. Rome proved to the whole world that it was capable of learning from its bloody mistakes. The Republic was able to rise from its knees and become even stronger after the hardest blows of fate. However, Marius's reforms had another, darker side to them, which became apparent later. The army gradually turned into an independent political force. Soldiers were now loyal first and foremost to their general, rather than to the abstract Senate in distant Rome. After all, it was the commander who paid them, divided the spoils, and promised them land after service. This laid a solid foundation for future civil wars and the fall of the Republic. Arausio, by destroying the old patriarchal army, indirectly led to the birth of the empire. Generals began to use their loyal legions to fight for power. Thus, the Battle of Arausio is not just a tragic episode in a history textbook. It is a key event that predetermined the fate of all of Europe for 1,000 years. Without this terrible defeat, Julius Caesar's famous legions would never have appeared. There would have been no Roman world as it entered world history. The catastrophe became a powerful catalyst for progress, paid for with the blood of 120,000 people. History teaches us that even the most terrible and shameful defeats can be the beginning of great victories. The main thing is to draw the right conclusions and not be afraid to break with the old for the sake of the new. Rome survived because it found the strength to change, discarding what was dragging it down. And this is the main lesson of Arausio for all times and peoples. The story of the Battle of Arausio is a stark reminder that the greatest threat to any state often comes from within. Unbridled ambition, political strife, and disregard for the common good can destroy even the most powerful empire faster than any external enemy. Gnaeus Mallius Maximus and Quintus Servilius Caepio went down in history not as defenders of Rome, but as architects of its greatest disgrace. But this is also a story of incredible resilience. Rome, on the brink of destruction, found the strength to rebuild itself, create a new army, and win. The price was terrible, but it was paid in full. Who do you think is more to blame? The arrogant Capio or the indecisive Maximus? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new investigations into the great battles of the past.